Chapter 9, The Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Part 3, 1863, The North Begins to Dominate. Burnside knew that he had to rescue his badly tarnished reputation by another assault on Fredericksburg. Thus, on January the 20th, 1863, he began moving his army back towards Fredericksburg, only to be greeted by rain and more rain. The roads turned to a sea of mud, and his army bogged down, exhausted from 4 days of futile effort to move forward. The endeavor was another disaster, though only to the army's morale and Burnside's personal reputation. 3 days later, Lincoln replaced Burnside with Fighting Joe Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Mounting opposition to the war. From a point very early in the war, the enthusiasm of the young men called to do the fighting subsided. By the beginning of the second year of the war, both North and South changed from a situation of having too many volunteers to train and equip to not having enough to make up for the heavy losses suffered in the numerous battles occurring everywhere. Conscription. The South, despite all the bravado about the Southern military ethic, was the first to have to resort to conscription. In April of 1862, the Confederacy passed a draft law calling into service all men, with a number of exempted categories by profession, between the ages of 18 and 35. In July, the North followed, asking that states to institute the draft when they could not meet their quotas. German and Irish immigrants contributed greatly to the Union armies, as did free blacks and liberated slaves when the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, opening up Negro service as the beginning of 1863. The South, of course, could not or would not increase their number in arms in like manner. Rising resistance to the draft. But by 1863, with the war seeming to drag on endlessly with no end in sight, resistance to military service, and especially the draft, began to rise. In March, Congress allowed for draftees to pay a fee for exemption or to find a substitute to take the place of a draftee, a sort of bounty system. But this merely raised questions of integrity and commitment to the cause, at a time when enthusiasm for that cause was dwindling rapidly in both the North and the South. The New York City draft riots. In New York City, Irish who had been signed up for American citizenship, that is to build up the city's Democratic Party regime of Boss Tweed and his corrupt Tammany Hall cohorts, found out that in doing so, they'd signed up for the draft. In mid-July, this turned itself into a major riot of working-class Irish against the system in which wealthier Americans could buy their way out of the draft. They vented their anger, particularly against blacks, but also the homes of abolitionists, Protestant churches, and a number of businesses, turning the event into largely a race riot. Troops had to be called in to help the New York City Police and state militia finally crush the rebellion and restore peace to the city. But it left the city shaken badly, especially among the blacks who moved out of the city to either Brooklyn, not part of the city at that time, or New Jersey. And the South was quick to point up the event as an example of the true nature of Northern race relations. Vallandigham and the Copperheads. Meanwhile, considerable trouble was being stirred up by another group of opponents to the war, largely from among the anti-war Democrats in the North, especially Ohio, who eventually drew the label Copperheads. Under the leadership of Clement Vallandigham, they opposed the draft, opposed King Lincoln, opposed the Emancipation Proclamation, and called for an immediate peace with the Confederates, which would have left the issue of Southern slavery untouched. Republicans accused the Copperheads of treason, and in May of 1863, Vallandigham was arrested by a military tribunal for encouraging Americans to take up arms against the Union. Much controversy followed his arrest, so Lincoln decided that rather than try him for treason, Vallandigham was to be banished to the Confederacy. Vallandigham eventually made his way to Canada and proceeded from there to be nominated as a Democratic Party candidate for Ohio governor. He subsequently lost the election, but deepened the division among the people of Ohio over the question of the war and of slavery. While still in Canada, by the way, Vallandigham attempted to set up a Northwest Confederacy of Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois as an ally of the Southern Confederacy. But nothing came of the plans. He slipped back into the United States in order to be able to attend the 1864 Democratic National Convention. Lincoln decided simply to ignore him, hoping to be the party's presidential nominee. But that honor was to go to General McClellan instead. However, with the continuing advance of the Union armies against the Confederacy, support for the Copperheads would eventually fade away, but they would be a serious problem for Lincoln until things finally began to improve. Chancellorsville, May the 1st to the 6th. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, Union General Hooker had spent the winter months of early 1863 rebuilding the demoralized Northern Army of the Potomac. The next spring, he set out in the direction of Fredericksburg, but swung to the west of the town to draw Lee's army away from it. At a crossroads clearing known as Chancellorsville, elements of the two armies met. But despite having more than twice the number of troops as Lee, at this point, Hooker strangely took a defensive position, though he sent part of his men to try to sweep in behind Lee. Lee then attacked Hooker, and for 2 days both armies fought fiercely, until Hooker disengaged and retreated back across the Rappahannock River, humiliated in his ability to defeat an army less than half the size of his. Lincoln would soon replace him with yet another general, George Meade. But the loss was great on both sides. The Union lost 17,000 soldiers, and the Confederates nearly 13,000 soldiers. But the Confederates also lost Jackson, when a Confederate guard mistakenly shot Jackson while the latter was out late at night studying the land in preparation for the next day's action. Jackson died on the 10th of May, a huge loss to the South. Gettysburg, July 1st to the 4th. After Chancellorsville, Lee understood that his best strategy would be once again to take the war into the North and conduct a bold strike against the Northern Army, which in turn would likely force Lincoln to have to give in to the rising voices in the North demanding immediate peace with the South. When Meade got his new orders to take command of the Union Army of the Potomac, Lee already had a number of his troops in southern Pennsylvania, with the Confederate cavalry under Jeb Stuart raiding the countryside. It looked as if Lee intended to grab the Pennsylvania capital Harrisburg, so Meade gathered his forces and headed northwest from Maryland to intercept him. On June the 30th, at a small Lutheran seminary town of Gettysburg, forward elements of the two armies met. For the next 3 days, the two armies fought each other, the Union armies holding defensively the upper grounds and the Confederate armies attempting to dislodge or even surround the well-entrenched Union position. This time, the immense boldness of Lee did not suffice to carry the day, despite the massive effort Lee applied to the task of overrunning the Union position. Even a massive frontal assault across 1 mile of open field produced merely huge Confederate losses. Finally, on the 4th of July, Lee ordered the retreat of his army back towards Virginia. Tragically, Meade did nothing to pursue the retreating army. He and his troops were exhausted, but so were Lee's. Once again, like the generals before him, Meade could not think past the issue of the battle at hand and understand that he had a war, not just a battle to win. But letting Lee escape back to Virginia, he had let slip by the opportunity to end the war then and there. Lincoln was pleased with Meade's victory, but was upset that Meade had missed what to Lincoln was an obvious opportunity to crush Lee's army and end the war. Yet it was still a grand disaster for the South, and Lee recognized immediately that he had gambled the lives of his men foolishly. He lost 28,000 of his 70,000 troops, but it had been costly for the North as well. Meade had lost 23,000 of his army of over 90,000. Nonetheless, it was Lee, not Meade, who had been broken by this action. Lee would never be able or willing again to try an assault on the North. Henceforth, the war would involve the South trying to protect itself from invading Northern armies. Gettysburg and Vicksburg then marked the turning point of the war, although this time this was not widely understood in the North. Grant's victory at Vicksburg, also July 4th. Meanwhile, off in the West, things were finally beginning to improve. Grant had finally succeeded in getting his Army of the Tennessee swung south around Vicksburg and inland towards the Mississippi state capital at Jackson. He was able to bring that vital Confederate city to surrender, May the 14th, opening the way for him to swing west and attack Vicksburg from its less well-defended eastern approach by land. Vicksburg was now surrounded on all sides by Union troops, and the slow process of strangling the city now began. For a month and a half, the citizens of Vicksburg withstood constant bombardment and loss of supplies to feed the town. Finally, on the 4th of July, with the citizens of the town nearly starved to death, Vicksburg capitulated. Thus, Grant was able to present Lincoln with the wonderful news of the full control of the Mississippi River, another Independence Day gift, along with Gettysburg, given to the much beleaguered president. The Union could now move supplies up and down the river unimpeded. At the same time, the Western Confederacy, most notably Texas and Arkansas, was now cut off and isolated from the rest of the Confederacy. Chickamauga, September, and Chattanooga, November. The action now moved to the center of the north-south line of battle, along the Tennessee River in southeastern Tennessee. Union General Rosecrans's Army of the Cumberland had been pushing General Bragg's Confederate troops south through Tennessee, and having reached Chattanooga, they were ready now to push into Georgia. In the meantime, Rosecrans had sent Burnside to Knoxville, where there was considerable pro-Union sentiment, to secure that city for the North. It had been fairly easy, but that was about to change. Chickamauga, September 19th and the 20th. In his push south into Georgia, Rosecrans did not get very far before running into a deep forest along Chickamauga Creek, where, unknown to Rosecrans, Bragg's forces had been reinforced by Confederate General Longstreet's troops. Although operating blindly in the dense forest, the Confederates found a gap in the Union lines, split the Union forces in two, and then turned hard on one of the two Union groups. It was a Union disaster. But the other half, under General George Thomas, a Virginian who had stayed loyal to the Union, held off the Confederates long enough to let what was left of the Union Army retreat back to Chattanooga. Footnote: Thomas would be called the Rock of Chickamauga for his role in saving Rosecrans's army. It had been a devastating battle for the Union, but also for the Confederates. The Confederates had lost 21,000 casualties compared to the 16,000 Union casualties. Thus, the Confederate victory at Chickamauga had come at a huge price that the South could ill afford. Chattanooga, November the 24th and the 25th. The situation in Chattanooga for the Union Army grew desperate as it was now surrounded by well-positioned Confederate troops who had cut off the Union Army's line of supplies, including food. In the meantime, Lincoln had put the entire Central and Western Command under Grant, who in turn replaced Rosecrans with Thomas as the new commander of the Army of the Cumberland. And Grant made sure that supplies and troops, Hooker's troops from the east and the troops of William Tecumseh Sherman from the west, made it past the Confederate blockade. By late November, the Union Army was ready to fight. The biggest challenge was the huge Lookout Mountain, from which the Confederates could dominate the town and the movement of goods and troops in and out of Chattanooga. That had to be taken, although it was well defended by Confederate troops atop a 500-foot-high cliff. In fact, it was so well defended that Bragg decided to send Longstreet and his troops off to retake Knoxville, considerably reducing the size of the Confederate army surrounding Chattanooga. Grant's plan was to send Hooker's troops around one side of the mountain and Sherman's troops around the other side, with Thomas's troops to hit the mountain straight on, mostly as a diversionary action, until Hooker and Sherman's troops could get in position. But Thomas's troops, once they got going, refused to halt at the foot of the mountain and began to climb wildly straight up its heights, terrorizing the Confederates, who could hardly believe what they were seeing. In the end, the Confederates scrambled back up the mountain and then over the other side, and did not stop running until they were well out of range. The Union Army had thus broken Bragg's position, and now a humiliated Bragg was forced to retreat south. Knoxville. In the meantime, Union General Burnside had been able to hold off Longstreet's Confederates at Knoxville, and with Sherman now able to come to Burnside's assistance, Longstreet was forced to break off his efforts to retake Knoxville. At this point, the Union Army settled in at Chattanooga for the winter in preparation for the next spring's offensive against central Georgia, the very heart of the Confederacy.